Hello, welcome back. This is lecture 11. Happy to have you back. Our lectures up to now have centered on early Buddhism, or a focus on some of the elements that are found in the maritime world, reflecting ancient patterns, structures, and practices. Among these, references have been made to communal monastic communities. The debates that evolved as differences developed among Buddhists. Reverence for the bodily relics of Shakyamuni. Architectural remains of monasteries and stupas. Use of narrative art to remind followers of the events from the past. In these ways, Buddhism appearing in the maritime environments was not severed from its roots in India or the life of Shakyamuni, but concurrent with early Buddhist aspects. Maritime Buddhism was also a key player in the spread of Mahayana. Now, Mahayana was not one of the 18 schools, but it was influenced by them, and its teachings helped to reflect the interpretations of the teachings that resulted from the long debates among them. It differed from the 18 in the sense that it went beyond just reliance on or interpretation of oral memory. It added innovations to Buddhism. One of the most important contributions from Mahayana was the acceptance of writing. The maritime world of the Great Circle was intimately involved, which was then a new technology for maintaining the teachings. Written text. While oral recitations had always been a part of early Buddhist ritual, the importance of manuscripts among travelers of the Rim show that maritime merchants were helping the tradition move into the literate age. It is thought that sea traders with large shipments were early adopters of writing for record keeping. They, more than the Brahmanic priestly tradition or the government, represented a literate group in India. It's not too much to say that maritime merchants probably helped to teach the Buddhists to read and write. Making the move from business documents and inventory lists to transcriptions of spiritual teachings was a major one. In the Perfection of Wisdom sutras that were introduced by Mahayana, we find the first canonic reference to the value of writing. The sutras of this family of Mahayana texts proclaimed writing to be a sacred art of merit making. They held that the amount of merit from writing down just one verse of the Perfection of Wisdom text was beyond measurement and many times greater than acquired from building stupas. These written documents changed an important part of Buddhism as they replaced the ancient reliance on the orality of memory. Now, Mahayana as a physical presence in India was for many centuries a minority movement. The first ones to self-identify as Mahayanists built few monasteries. Much to the surprise of Chinese pilgrims, Mahayana monks were found living in monasteries that still had association with the 18 schools. In contrast to monastic structures, Mahayana's earliest activities that set it apart, as just mentioned, was its reliance on written text. It was mainly a literary tradition, in which the power of those who followed it was dependent upon the spread of manuscripts declaring the superiority of his teachings. Now, the written texts of Mahayana appear sometime after the 2nd century before the Common Era. How much of this content represents an undocumented oral tradition extending back to the time of Shakyamuni? This continues to be debated. Certainly, the written Mahayana texts that we have today introduced innovations to the canonic record, such as the idea of multiple Buddhas from the distant past who had played a role in the progress of the past lives of Shakyamuni. The Mahayana Sutra also tells us of millions of Buddhas who are existing in the multiverses of endless space and time. Along with these, many Buddhas, such as Amitabha, who populate the cosmos, Mahayana introduced a new way to look at bodhisattvas. In early Buddhism, the term referred to the former lives of Shakyamuni, when he was given the title of a bodhisattva, one who had made the vow to become enlightened and works toward that goal through actions in lifetime after lifetime. Mahayana broadens the concept of the bodhisattva to include a pantheon of beings who have achieved a higher level of practice, leading to an enlightened state. Such bodhisattvas are like Shakyamuni, immortals who achieve an existence based on their efforts through practice of yogic concentrations and veneration of Buddhas over countless eons. It was a major contribution of Mahayana texts to add a new type. This new vision of the bodhisattva was more similar to eternals, beings who have existed from time immemorial, possessing great supernormal power. The eternal bodhisattvas, first found in Mahayana texts, were to become widely known through textual accounts and cultural ritual activities associated with them. These latter ones, including such famous names as Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, Samantabhadra, Kshitigarbha. Well, as might be expected, scholars have long attempted to comprehend the source and the nature of these written texts that brought elements into Buddhism not found in the oral tradition of early Buddhism. An extended debate has been directed toward the identification of the initial home of proclamations that appear in Mahayana texts. The two candidates for the site of this emergence are in Southeast India at Nagarjunakonda, a seaport, or another location in the northwest of India. No consensus has been forthcoming from the arguments put forth by supporters for one or the other of these theories. Well, from the point of view of the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism, the question of choosing one of the two regions may be fruitless. Instead of thinking that the two are far apart across the whole length and breadth of the peninsula, they might be considered as parts of a system. From the west coast of India, a series of sailing circuits followed the rim of the Great Circle of Buddhism around the subcontinent to the east coast. The mercantile merchants who made use of these circuits were the ones who probably introduced writing and helped to spread texts as they carried goods and personnel wherever their commercial ventures carried them. It may well be that we should see the emergence of Mahayana not as coming from either of two unrelated, disconnected regions, but as a tradition that was moving both ways on the sailing circuits from the east coast to the west coast of India. Nagarjunakonda and northwest India lay at points along the maritime trade routes, and contacts between them must have been a regular feature of the travel flowing back and forth. Mahayana may not have a single locus from which it expanded. Instead, its origins are to be found in the dynamic of the groups within the arc of the rim of the Great Circle that covered the west and east coasts of India. Rather than trying to explain Mahayana origins with episodic aspects of conventional history, this approach attempts to understand it within the maritime system of forces that are political, economic, spatial, social, and religious. So as Buddhist sites developed, in a multitude of sites from India to China, many of them had Mahayana influence. For example, we can return to the lore about the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the patron saint of mariners. His images abound at the river mouth ports in Sri Lanka, where his gaze is towards the sea and those who sail upon it. In China, where the seafarers had long been under the protection of the sea goddess, the arrival of Avalokiteshvara, who provided the same service, required some thought. It seems that the sea goddess became known as a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara under his Chinese name of Guanyin. In this way, the sea goddess belief was transferred to Guanyin, who was understood to be a female aspect of the Bodhisattva, and thus a gender designation changed. Many have tried to understand how Avalokiteshvara became a female by looking at the textual tradition of the Buddhist canonic literature that arrived at Chang'an over the inner Asian caravan routes. Nothing definitive has been found in those texts to explain the shift from male to female for this eternal bodhisattva. Once we use the lens of the sea route and the practices associated with it, this issue takes on a completely different look, and we can put forward the claim that the changing nature of Avalokiteshvara was related to the sea and the protection of those who braved its dangers. Now, Mahayana texts made an appearance in China in the 2nd century of the Common Era, when a Kushan monk, Lokshema, began to translate Indic texts into Chinese. Now, the Translation Bureau at the capital of the Han Dynasty, Chang'an, was a major source of information about Mahayana thought. The outpouring of Mahayana texts from the capital established this tradition as the most important form of Buddhism. Chinese pilgrims to India, such as Xuanzang, were surprised to find little evidence of its strength in the homeland. They had to accept that it was a minority movement with little real estate in the sense of monastic campuses. However, the technology of writing and making manuscript collections produced a profound effect in the Great Circle. The literary documents, perhaps more than teachers or institutional structures, inspired a large group of readers outside of India. And it was through the dependence on written textual documents that Mahayana eventually became a dominant tradition in East Asia. The earliest texts arriving in China through the portal of the caravan routes, now known as the Silk Road, the maritime route, opened up a new portal for the dissemination of Buddhism to the Chinese. By contrast to the caravan routes in the north, the port of Guangzhou in the south became a new and dominant entry point by the 6th century of the Common Era. Through this portal came a series of teachers, texts, and artisans who would change Chinese Buddhism from its dependence on early influences that flowed along those caravan routes in the north. The forms of Buddhism that came through the southern portals are now those that dominate the East Asian tradition. Schools of thought such as Yogacara, mind, consciousness only, Chan, meditation practices, Tantric, esoteric methods of achievement, Vinaya, rules of conduct, in particular for nuns, form major ways of practice for Buddhism in the present age. They all entered from the maritime world through South China. Buddhism, based entirely on the Han and later dynasty translated texts, is no longer practiced as a distinct movement in China. Buddhist elements that belong to the time when economic power in China was moving to the coastal cities and the south need to be recognized. A more accurate history of Chinese Buddhism is one including thought and practices that arrived in the ports of the southern coastline of China. Take, for example, the introduction of Chan meditation. Buddhist practices that are acknowledged to be central to the monastic life in any Chinese center. The first extant record of someone being called a Chan master comes from an account written in 406 of the Common Era. The reference was to Buddhabhadra, an Indian monk who had been trained in Kashmir before setting sail for China. It is counterintuitive to accept the fact that Kashmiri travelers made the trip to China by sea. Far more likely in common view was that the trip from Kashmir to China must have been over the caravan routes. However, now there's now no doubt that a number of Buddhist monks made their way from Kashmir or northwest India to China by sea. The case of Buddhabhadra gives an instance of where multiple and recognized sources report his arrival by sea. Well, nevertheless, one record says he came by Inner Asia, but the single dissenting account gives no proof for that assertion. It's probable that the writer just assumed that all travelers from Kashmir came by caravan routes. The weight of the evidence indicates that Buddhabhadra, the first to be called Chan Master, came by sea. In this case, we read that he landed at Donghai in the north, rather than Guangzhou. It was a unique story of a monk using a port of entry so far to the north. It's not unreasonable to assume that northern ports such as Donghai would be used, since they were the nearest portals for commerce and travel to the capital. The narrative takes Buddhabhadra from Donghai to Chang'an, that is Xi'an, where as the first holder of the title Chan Master, he started to teach. At that time, the most famous monk in the capital was Kumarajiva, who was the great translator of Sanskrit texts into Chinese and an ardent missionary for Mahayana. Buddhabhadra seems to have stressed the crucial importance of lineage for a meditation teacher. He himself was from a well-established line of Kashmiri masters, such as Buddhasena. It appears that Kumarajiva, for all his fame and ability with meditation text translations, could not lay claim to such a heritage of training. This may have provoked the troubled relationship between the two Indian monks, perhaps worsened by the implication that Buddhabhadra was superior to Kumarajiva in terms of meditation practice. Kumarajiva being a favorite of the court, it is not surprising that in 410 of the Common Era, Buddhabhadra was exiled for a time from the capital, and his practices were criticized as deviant. Another monk of the same lineage as Buddhabhadra, Dharmayashas, arrived in Guangzhou and began to spread the Chan training in the south before he finally went to the capital. The meditation techniques of these Kashmiri Chan masters became well established among their disciples, mostly in the southern port cities. Well, the most famous of those called Chan masters was Bodhidharma. His fame led to many stories about his journey and his practice. So it's difficult to find the historical person among the various depictions. There is general agreement that he came from South India, made the journey by sea to Guangzhou, although there was the usual claim by a few that he, like Buddhabhadra, came by land rather than sea. It seems likely that he would have followed in the footsteps of others at that time and made entry by the sea portal at Guangzhou. Art depictions show him as fierce-visaged, almost glaring at the world in front of him. If he approached the emperor with such an attitude, it's not surprising that the audience was a failure. Having found the difficulties of dealing with officialdom in China, he is said to have retreated to a secluded cave where potential disciples were challenged to find him and be allowed to practice near him. Instead of verbal teaching, his method was described as taking place in mind-to-mind communication. He is depicted as absorbed in seated meditation, facing a wall. Given these examples of withdrawal from regular discourse and contact, it's not easy to account for his importance. Described as the founder of the Chan tradition, a dominant feature of contemporary Chinese monastic practice. However, his place in Chinese history is fully established, even including a role in martial arts. At the same time, we need to remember that Chan teachers, other than Bodhidharma, were part of the story of the transmission of this teaching and practice. Now, another group in Mahayana were those belonging to Yogacara. It's a word used to identify the works and activities of a number of teachers who dealt with structure and functions of consciousness. They searched for the reality that lay behind all the appearances of our perceptive senses. This literature began to appear in China at the beginning of the 5th century. But the school took on new dimension when the master Paramartha arrived by sea in Guangzhou in 546. His biographical account says that he was born in Ujjayini in a Brahmin family. Before arriving in Guangzhou, it is said he spent time in Funan, Vietnam. Paramartha's main message was to help guide people toward the achievement of pure consciousness. It is in this state that subject and object are eliminated from the process of sensory perception. Later, in 695 of the Common Era, the pilgrim Yi Jing returned from his sea travel to India and brought with him not only the Vinaya text of monastic rules, but also commentaries to the works of Dignaga and Vasubandhu, major figures in the Yogacara discourse. As a result of Yi Jing's work, a Yogacara center was set up in Hangzhou, near the major port of the Yangtze River. The big issue from Yogacara that captured the interest of the Chinese was whether all beings possess Buddha nature and can be assured of achieving Buddhahood. The answer to this question lay in the interpretation of the components of consciousness. Even as late as the 7th century, Xuanzang could not find answers to the meaning of Buddha nature as described in the various Yogacara texts available to him in China. This is one of the major reasons he took his famous journey to the West, to find teachers in India to help him resolve such questions. Well, the school is sometimes called mind only, and certainly the attention was on perception and how human experience is constructed. Yogacara identified 8 components of consciousness and their interactions with one another. It was this description of the internal interaction of different parts of consciousness that gave the name mind only. The idea of giving less and less value to external experience was enhanced by the further analysis asserting that the mind has a storehouse of impressions that have existed from all past influences. The building blocks of our thoughts are therefore within us, activated when conditions are sufficient to cause them to appear. Chinese Buddhist philosophy is strongly influenced by this teaching. This is a brief introduction to the story of Mahayana as a maritime school. In future lectures, we will return to this story and attempt to understand the situations and locations where Mahayana came to be the major expression of Buddhism. Thank you for attending the lecture. Look forward to seeing you for lecture 12.